Hi, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway. I want to share with you about how we begin. This is the first of my New Year's messages, and it comes from 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 16 through 19. We'd love to have you come and be a part of our services today. At Riverdale, our service begins at 8:30 this Sunday morning, and at Garrison, our service begins at 10:30. So we'd invite you to come and be a part of either of these two services. In 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 21, it says, "And Elijah came to all the people," meaning the Israelite people, "and said, 'How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him.' But the people answered him not a word." Elijah in this situation is struggling with a question about decisions. He's challenging the people of Israel about their need for a decision in life. Decisions are tough things to make, and all of us struggle with indecision. Part of the reason why we hire politicians to run things for us is that we are hiring them to make decisions. We want them to push us in directions where we're not quite willing to go. Hopefully they know more than we do, but sometimes they don't. In fact, the older I get, I'm more and more convinced they don't. But the truth of the matter is that is the reason why we have them. The reason why companies hire CEOs is to make decisions. In fact, we all struggle with this issue of indecisiveness. There are a lot of reasons why we have indecision in our lives. Some of the most startling reasons are that we are overwhelmed with the many different options that come and are in our way. They did a study with grocery stores, and they gave people a choice of 24 different items in one case, or in another case, they gave them up to a choice of 80 different items in the store aisle. They then followed those customers to see what would happen. What they discovered is that when customers were given a smaller group of options to look at, they were more likely to purchase something in the grocery store. If they were given a huge, like 80 different items to choose from, they very often got so frustrated with the decision-making process that they failed to buy anything. It's important that we are not overwhelmed by the many different options that we face in life. And that's one of the things that we struggle with as individuals as we come into this situation of this next year. There are so many different things going on, so many different options, so many things that are coming at us at one time that it becomes discouraging to even make decisions and stick by those decisions. The second reason why people have indecision is they want to please other people. They don't want to make anybody upset in the process. And as a pastor, I've watched that process play out in churches to a destructive level, where no one is quite willing to make a decision because they're afraid of hurting somebody's feelings. That happens also in businesses. It happens in nations. Part of the reason why our nation has a chief executive called the president and not a prime minister is that we want somebody to make decisions. In a parliamentary system of government like in Great Britain and Canada, one of the problems they struggle with is not being able to please everybody, and so their government really on a whim can collapse and they will have to re-elect a new government. And that is part of that type of a system. Our system is designed for decision making, and that was part of the genius of the founders of our nation. So we want to be able to make decisions, and sometimes people are going to be unhappy with those decisions, but they need to be made. And that's one of the strengths of not being indecisive. Another reason that we have for indecision in our lives is that we're afraid of making the wrong decision. It is displayed by the fear of being seen as incompetent. And I think all of us struggle with that sense, is I don't want to be seen as incompetent, so it's better not to make a decision. In that process, we are hoping that we will make the best decision. But the truth of the matter is, we won't know that until after it's made and we see the effects of the decision. We can only guess at that and make our best educated guess. The fourth reason why people struggle with decision making is that they tend to overanalyze. In other words, they want to collect all the data they can collect, and they spend unbelievable amounts of time collecting data until time runs out and they're not able to make a decision. I have a few friends like this, and it's frustrating to be around them sometimes when they're trying to make a decision, because they've got to go find out one more fact. And the truth of the matter is that when we live our lives that way, we just can't make decisions. General Colin Powell would share his decision-making concept, and which is pretty much a military concept of how to make a decision. Once you've gotten about 40 to 70% of the data, you're in a position to make a decision. If you wait much longer than that and try and get all data beyond that, you will become too bogged down in the data and will not make a good decision, or will lose the window of opportunity to make a decision. So we have to be careful that we don't overanalyze our decisions. The fifth problem that we have, and this is probably the most frustrating and really in many ways the most dangerous, it is the inability or the unwillingness to take responsibility for our decisions. In those cases, very often we allow decisions to be made by mob rule. That becomes extremely frightening, because we can hide in the mob and not have to be responsible for the decision, even if that decision is a terrible decision that harms other people. We can hide from the responsibility of it. That's one of the things that the Bible clearly tells us as Christians, that when we make decisions, we need to make decisions and take responsibility. Because when we do not, we can end up hurting and harming other people. When we abandon the responsibility to a mob or to a group, that becomes a dangerous, dangerous situation for us. So as Christians, we must be willing to make decisions. It's interesting how that plays out in our country. We very seldom elect legislators as presidents in our nation, and there's a good reason for that. The problem is that many legislators are part of a group process for decision making. In that, they very often hide behind that group in not taking responsibility for their decisions. And so they are not good decision makers, because they are always hiding from the responsibility of the decision. Governors, because they are executives and have to make decisions, or CEOs that are managers of companies and have to take responsibility for decisions, are better decision makers. The reason for that is that to get into that position, they have to be a decision maker. And so we recognize that as a need in our president. But how do we begin? In the middle of the Civil War in 1862, Abraham Lincoln, who had made some really tough decisions up to this point and had taken responsibility for them, he is struggling because he had hoped the war would be over. In fact, he had been quite willing to negotiate a peace, but as the war dragged on into 1862, it became clear to him that it was going to be a long, bloody, and ugly conflict where many, many people were going to die, and that it would not be solved easily. Because most of the people in our nation were nominally religious, they struggled with why was God doing all this or allowing this in our nation at that time. There had been a lot of reasons that were given by people. Believe it or not, slavery was not the one on the top of the list for a lot of people in the 1860s, the early 1860s. There were things like government corruption, which our government was very corrupt at that point. There was the issue of societal corruption, and that included slavery, but it included a lot of other issues such as abuse and alcoholism and even drug abuse that was becoming common in our culture. There was also the issues of large, powerful companies and banks that were basically robbing the public and creating all kinds of uncomfortableness for people because of their greed and their desire for wealth. There was also the speculators who were speculating in land and their push to get government officials to approve that, and their willingness to use graft to do that. There had been the corruption of the electoral process, and so there was all kinds of things that were stirred up in the middle of this Civil War. Slavery was at the very center of it morally, because that had been driving the abolition movement that had created the Republican Party. But Abraham Lincoln was willing to give up abolition if it would bring peace. And so there was a lot of struggle in that. And Abraham Lincoln, writing in 1862, talks about this struggle, that in his opinion, God has brought judgment on our nation because of its injustice and its sinfulness as a nation, because it had been willing to tolerate some great evils, that this terrible civil war had come upon us, and he was convinced that that would not be solved until a great deal of blood was spilled in this conflict. When you look at the decade leading up to the Civil War, you see these forces already at work, and it parallels so closely many of the things that are happening in our culture right now, in fact, to a very frightening degree. How do we begin? Peter gives us 5 principles that I'll be sharing during my messages this morning. I invite you to come and be a part of that. But he gives us 5 principles from the 4th chapter of 1 Peter, verses 16 through 19, that prepare us to deal with a world that is coming unglued. And how do we as Christians face indecision? How do we face suffering? The worst decision to make is that one where we know that there's no good outcome on the front end of it. We know that if we make the decision, we're going to have to suffer one way or another. How do we make that decision, and how do we stick to it? That's one of the most difficult decisions we make. And Peter is talking to the Christians and saying, here's how you make those kind of decisions. Here's how you go forward. Here is how you begin. And so as we face this year of 2021, how do we begin? Well, we begin by being committed to God and His will and His purpose, and being committed to doing good. And those are important things for us. It must be God's will above our will in all things. Thank you for listening. God bless you, and you have a wonderful day.